A year later, the scene is much the same, but a game of pickup sticks has begun. The Weyerhaeuser Company, which lost 68,000 of its nearly 500,000 acres of timber near the mountain, is salvaging some of the downed timber. Not all the fury of Mount St. Helens flew through the air. This wall of water, mud, volcanic debris, and logs roared down the Toutle River at 30 miles an hour. The floods that came with the mud flow enlarged the 200-foot wide river to 1/3 of a mile. Now, a year later, it's difficult to realize that the Toutle River was once clear and beautiful, one of the finest fishing streams in the Northwest. The scars of the gigantic mud flow remain, and the waters are still gray with volcanic ash. Agricultural losses in Washington state totaled $55 million, but dire predictions of agricultural disaster did not come true. Here in the fertile Yakima Valley, the net result was beneficial. At David Hall's ranch, an alfalfa crop was covered with 3/4 of an inch of ash, but the ashfall did more good than harm.
Our small grain crops probably did the best they ever have. They were not headed out at the time, and the ash fell right through to the ground and held the moisture in and reflected the sun off of the ground and kept the ground cool, and they just did fantastic.
A year after the major eruption, the tourist business is booming.
We're anticipating about 3 million additional travelers to the Northwest because of the mountain.
Nearby Portland, Oregon is now promoting Mount St. Helens as a prime tourist attraction. Last summer, there was fear that ashfalls would wreck the tourist trade. Volcanic mud flows no longer clog the Columbia River. $225 million has been spent in dredging and flood control operations since the eruption.
It will rank as one of the major pieces of emergency type work that the Corps of Engineers has ever been faced with.
The engineers have been building 2 flood control dams in the mud flows of the Toutle River below the volcano. Fortunately, this winter's snows were abnormally light, but a serious flood threat remains, and hundreds of homes could again be endangered. Helicopters are being used to fertilize areas where grass seed has been planted to prevent erosion. Restoring vegetation is a slow process along the river. On the mountain, it's even slower. It's going to be centuries before nature can restore this scene of death and devastation. But as you can see, the process has already begun. Continuation of that process depends on the volcano. How frequent and how violent will future eruptions be? Even the top government scientist at Mount St. Helens is not sure.
We could have further explosive eruptions here. We don't really anticipate that there will be anything of the size of the May 18th eruption, but even that can't be excluded completely.
That doubt exists, even though Mount St. Helens is now the most wired volcano in the world. Seismographs record every tremor, and on a ridge 5 miles from the crater, geologists have erected a virtual laboratory of volcanology, including a videotape camera and a laser instrument that probes the mountain's surface. The information gathered here gives geologists a good chance of predicting what may happen tomorrow, but predicting what may happen next month or next year is largely guesswork. However, the eruption of Mount St. Helens has been very useful as a reminder that the western United States is an area of explosive volcanoes.
Effectively, any of the Cascade volcanoes could erupt. All of them have erupted within the last few thousand years.
In the Cascade Range, there are a dozen active volcanoes. 5 erupted in the 19th century, 2 in this century up to now, Mount St. Helens and California's Mount Lassen, which erupted repeatedly from 1914 through 1917. Other Cascade volcanoes have produced warning signals. In 1975, Mount Baker belched jets of steam and sulfur. And while Mount St. Helens was still smoking last summer, its neighbor Mount Hood was shaking with a series of earthquakes.
I think that there are probably a dozen of the Cascade volcanoes that have the potential for erupting again in the future. Mount Hood is certainly one of them. You've mentioned Mount Baker already and Lassen. I think that Shasta and Rainier are also strong candidates. Whether they will erupt in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, we can't be sure.
And uncertainty still hangs over Mount St. Helens. When you stand here on the side of the volcano 3 miles from the crater and consider the awesome force that blew away the top and the north face of the mountain, and when you consider that no one was able to predict an eruption of that magnitude, then it's easy to understand that precise predictions of the volcano's future activity are impossible.